Aubin and and I have the pleasure of being a Mary Slowska-Curie Fellow in Law and Energy Policy at University of Houston Law Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you all on behalf of the environment, energy, and natural resources in our center and the Center for US and Mexican Law to our monthly webinar on nonprofit energy cooperatives as the catalyst of the movement of people to renewable electricity. Our panel features Professor Melissa Scanlan and Professor Gabe Pacyniak, and we are also grateful to our audience of more than 200 attendees. That being said, let's get started. In 1987, the Chapter 6 of the report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, Our Common Future, opened as follows. Quote, energy is necessary for daily survival. Future development crucially depends on its long-term availability, unquote. It came to the conclusion that the patterns and changes in energy use should rely in the future on sufficient growth and of energy supplies to meet human needs and energy efficiency and conservation measures such as the waste of primary resources is minimized. Over the years, the role of electricity in the energy mix has become more important. Today, the global share of electricity rises to more than 30%, which tends to support the importance of electricity in decarbonization strategies. The World Energy Outlook for 2019 underlines that electricity should overtake oil around 2040 to become the largest component of the final consumption in the sustainable development scenario. In this regard, it is expected that electricity sector plays an important role in the access to energy. The global electrification rate for 2017 is 89%, while more than 840 million people left without access. The average rate of electrification for 2017 is 79% in rural areas and 97% in urban areas. Those figures are supported by the number of people who gain access from decentralized solutions, which are the least cost solutions according to the IEA 2019 World Energy Outlook. The decentralized solution as a means of production and supply begs per se the question of actors or players. To this extent, non-profit electric cooperatives tend to prove themselves valuable. According to the terms of the recommendation 193 of International Labour Organization, a cooperative is defined as, quote, an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. That is to say that cooperatives are based on the interaction of people, movement, common means, and democratic process. Therefore, the constant interest in electric cooperatives leans on inter alia, the community-based approach, direct access to renewable electricity, their availability and control, etc. Whatever value those considerations might have in relation to the empirical interest for electric cooperatives, our panel is going to show the current role and the prospect of electric cooperative in promoting universal access to energy, increasing energy efficiency, and furthering the development of renewable energy. On the one hand, Professor Melissa Scanlan is law professor at Vermont Law School, where she co-founded and is running the New Economy Law Center. She's also visiting law professor at Boston College Law School. She teaches a course on new energy frontiers in environmental policy and climate change law. A forthcoming scholar work is entitled Cooperating for a Livable Planet, Designing Business for Sustainability at Yale University Press, 2021. On the other hand, Professor Gabe Pacyniak is assistant professor of law at the University of New Mexico School of Law, where he teaches a course on energy and climate change law and policy. One of his recent scholar works is entitled New Mexico's Renewable Portfolio Standards, Analysis of Existing Policy Design Element and Compliance Obligations Beyond 2020. The question with regard to which the panel will discuss is, should we consider that cooperatives are fostering the deep decarbonization process, and what should be learned from case studies? Perhaps there are even some recommendations to provide.
So we have a huge challenge globally, and we need to figure out how to do this and meet this with renewable energy. So the faster we make these transitions within the next decade or two, that we know from the IPCC's reporting to us that the faster we move, the less disruption we're going to experience from climate change and the less suffering we will have around the world. To the question of deeply decarbonizing electricity, I just want to run through a few of the larger points that of action that we need to be keeping in mind here. As I've mentioned before, deploying comprehensive energy efficiency and conservation programs, so we're reducing our demands on the system. And part of that would be through enforceable performance standards for buildings. We'll need to retire fossil fuel electric generating plants that do not capture and store the greenhouse gases they emit. And we'll need to rapidly deploy renewable energy generating capacity in ways that are the least environmentally destructive. So focusing on built surfaces, brownfields, renewables that are compatible with multiple uses, and offshore renewables. And as we move more and more transportation onto electricity, we need to plan for greater electricity demands. That is also true for heating. moving more and more heating to electric heating. We'll need to be incentivizing switching to electric vehicles, emphasizing fleets and ways for people to share the vehicles. And of course, the biggest issue with smoothing out variability in renewable generation involves storing that electricity for times when the renewable systems aren't generating it. So we need to invest in storage technology and breakthroughs. This kind of system is also very much going to thrive when we have a diversity and abundance of customer-sited generation and storage. And so the business model will need to change to account for that. And finally, the other issues related to decarbonization that I just outlined really have to do with technology. But the last point is about the type of businesses that can position us to make this move to deeply decarbonize electricity. And this is business structures that emphasize democratic ownership and participation, that are focused on multiple co-benefits like reducing energy poverty, ensuring a just transition, and equitably sharing the benefits of renewables with people who have so far missed out. So I'm going to be talking about disrupting business as usual. And we hear about business as usual when we're looking at the climate models as it relates to how the level of greenhouse gases that continue to go up under a business as usual model. So we think about that in the emissions scenario. I want to talk about it in the business model as well, and why we should care about the business model as we're changing as we're deeply decarbonizing electricity. So overall, across the world, the 100 largest economic entities, of them, 69 are investor-owned corporations. And I draw your attention to that statistic because as we're seeing businesses consolidate through globalization, this really dwarfs the power of the state to regulate. And so that kind of structure results in a lot more negative externalities because the state doesn't have the power to effectively regulate a growing consolidation of businesses. And that's why we keep seeing climate change, greenhouse gases increasing, biodiversity decreasing, wealth inequality increasing, and human rights abuses. There are alternative business models, and B corporations are one example that has been around for the past decade, and cooperatives are another model that have been around for hundreds of years since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Some cooperatives are also B corporations, but I want to focus here on cooperatives as a model. And the reason I'm emphasizing this model is not because cooperatives always result in better outcomes for people, but that the model allows for the flexibility to produce co-benefits of democracy and meeting sustainable development goals while bringing in electricity to those who currently lack it. And that these co-benefits are much more likely with a purpose-driven business. So what are cooperatives? You heard a little bit about it in the introduction to this panel. They can be organized as for-profits or not-for-profits. They are organized for a purpose based on a shared system of ethics, values, and principles, and the International Cooperative Alliance defines these globally. So some examples of these shared principles and values are democratic governance, that each member in the cooperative is entitled to 1 vote, that the cooperatives will be participating with supporting other cooperatives and building that part of the economy. There's a principle of solidarity that focuses on fair trade. And as it relates to the environment, the 7th cooperative principle is to care for the community. The International Cooperative Alliance has articulated what that means in terms of protecting the environment and sustainable development. And so it's these sets of principles that can animate cooperatives and help orient their day-to-day business operations. Where are they in the economy? They're in every sector of the economy in most countries in the world. Energy cooperatives are just one type that exists, but there are also water cooperatives, insurance cooperatives, farmer cooperatives, you name it. And oftentimes people don't realize this in the US, but there are more people in the US who are members of cooperatives than owners of stock. So this is something that affects many millions of people's lives in the US as well as in other parts of the world. As it relates to our topic today, cooperatives were really critical to bringing electricity to rural America during the New Deal era. And you're going to hear more about that in a little bit from our other speaker. So I won't go into it at this point. So what's the difference with cooperatives? Because these types of businesses are value-driven, they have a value-driven business model, they have a shared principle of sustainable development. Because of this, they have a tremendous potential to fundamentally alter the way we do business. That is not to say they're always meeting the model, but that the potential is there because there isn't a conflict between their purpose and protecting the environment. For renewable energy, we're seeing this new type of cooperative emerging, or some historic cooperatives orienting themselves to renewable energy. And this type of enterprise really lends itself to meeting multiple sustainable development goals. I've outlined several of them here. Accessing affordable, reliable, sustainable energy, responding to climate change, providing decent work and economic growth, reducing inequalities, supporting sustainable cities and communities, and promoting responsible consumption and production, so promoting the conservation of energy and producing it through renewable sources. And more than ever, we need lawyers to approach this new area of decarbonizing electricity with a keen eye towards legal design of ownership and governance, and really understanding how cooperatives can be structured to maximize their benefits for democracy, society, and the environment. So before we switch over to Gabe, I want to just briefly go over 4 steps in providing electricity, getting from generation point to being able to turn on your computer in your remote office. So the first step is production. These are the facilities that generate electricity, and then that electricity is transported on high voltage wires that move it from the point of production to transformer substations. This is often referred to as the grid. There is then distribution, moving electricity from the substations to consumers on lower voltage and medium voltage wires. And finally, commercialization. These are companies that buy electricity on wholesale markets, direct it, and bill it to a consumer. Cooperatives are operating in all 4 steps in the electricity system. Some steps more than others, as you'll hear in the case studies, but each of these steps has a potential, cooperatives play a potential role. So at this point, I'm going to turn back the screen, if I can, to you, Gabe. Are you able to share now, Gabe?
Please unmute.
All right, I trust everyone can hear me. Thank you, Melissa and Aubin, for that introduction and starting point. So as Aubin said, I'm Gabe Pacyniak from the University of New Mexico, and I'll just start by saying that I became interested in cooperatives when I took an academic position here in New Mexico about 3 years ago, because New Mexico has 19 rural electricity cooperatives, and more generally, some of the cooperatives in the New Mexico-Colorado area are some of the co-ops that are looking for opportunities and also finding challenges in shifting to a lower carbon electricity system. And I'll be talking about that today. So what I'd like to do is start with giving a little bit of a history of an overview of how rural electricity cooperatives became so widespread in rural US. So the co-ops were a product of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. Starting in the 1930s, at that time in the US, most cities and towns were electrified. But the rural communities were another story. Only about 10% of rural communities were electrified, and that was in stark contrast to what was happening in some countries in Europe, where there was about 50 to 90% electrification in rural areas. Now, rural communities in the US did pose a different challenge. The farms are far apart. They required a greater investment in terms of wires and poles. Rural residents were generally poorer, and the perception was that they would use less electricity. And also at the time, there weren't widespread uses for electrification developed for farms at that time. But in the 1930s, progressives saw the lack of electrification as a major social issue, contributing to poor health outcomes and quality of life. So in 1932, Franklin Roosevelt campaigned for the presidency on a platform of developing public hydropower resources and using them for rural electrification. And this was particularly salient because for-profit utilities had just experienced a period of rapid consolidation into holding companies, and that ended in an implosion of many of those companies during the Great Depression that left many ordinary Americans holding worthless stocks. So there was a lot of public skepticism of the for-profit utility model. And Roosevelt blamed for-profit utilities for the lack of rural electrification, saying they'd been too short-sighted to create a widespread, low-cost electricity system in rural America. He argued for the creation of large publicly owned hydroelectric resources starting in the Tennessee Valley that could provide electricity to power rural America and serve as a yardstick to ensure that for-profit utilities were setting fair electricity rates. And 2 years after he was elected, his administration sought to use Depression-era relief funding from Congress for rural electrification. It's kind of interesting because the New Dealers initially approached for-profit utilities to use this money from Congress to electrify rural America. But the utilities plan would have only reached a small portion of rural Americans, only the most affluent rural users, and would have used up all of the funds. Municipal utilities were also unwilling to take on the challenge at the scope that the administration was looking for. So somewhat reluctantly, without other options, the New Dealers turned towards the cooperative model that Melissa was describing. And there were some benefits already because farmers already were familiar with co-ops because they were using co-ops for grain elevators and marketing cooperatives at the time. Also, there were some co-ops, a few co-ops in the US that were electricity co-ops, and the model had been successful in some countries in Europe. So in 1934 and 1935, Congress appropriated funds for rural electrification, including in 1935 through the Rural Electrification Act. And through that act, it created the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, and the law directed the agency to provide loan preferences for rural electrification to public agencies and to cooperatives. The REA became the lead agency for proselytizing the co-op movement throughout rural America, and it acted as a lender but it also provided technical support. It provided model legislation to states to authorize these cooperatives, and it provided legal services, engineering services, management, financial services to the co-ops to help stand them up. And the co-ops were based on the model that Melissa was describing. They were nonprofit, they are and were nonprofit organizations. Each participant was a member owner and had a vote in the governance of the co-op. It could sit on the co-op's board. Now, for-profit utilities saw all of this as competition, and they were bitterly opposed to it. They would build spite lines along the most affluent corridors in rural territories, trying to balkanize service territories that might be available to cooperatives. And they also tried to challenge cooperatives in court, ultimately unsuccessfully. But the co-ops were fantastically successful, as this great chart shows. One of the reasons I love working on this is because there's all these fabulous graphics from the New Deal era. But this chart shows by 1953, over 90% of rural farms in the US were receiving electric service. And the REA had loaned $2.7 billion by this time to over 1,000 utility borrowers, 90% of which were cooperatives. So cooperatives succeeded in electrifying rural America in a period of about 20 years, an extraordinary accomplishment. Now, to procure cheap power, cooperatives, these distribution cooperatives, which were putting up power poles and wires to get electricity to these rural farms, formed generation and transmission cooperatives. Initially, when the Roosevelt administration formed the REA, they envisioned that these distribution cooperatives would be the main entities that were being supported by this federal support. And that the distribution cooperatives would procure electricity from either these large federal hydropower projects or from for-profit power producers. They also envisioned that these distribution cooperatives would contract with for-profit power providers for the transmission service, the high voltage electricity lines that would bring the electricity to these distribution service territories. In practice, however, co-ops found that for-profit utilities were not willing to negotiate in good faith, and in many cases, they weren't able to procure wholesale power or transmission service at fair rates. Co-ops therefore started to band together to form generation and transmission cooperatives, or G&Ts, that could build, own, and operate power plants and transmission lines. And starting in the 1940s, once rural America was largely electrified, the REA focused its federal efforts on financing generation and transmission in these power supply cooperatives so that it could reduce the electricity rates, available wholesale electricity rates, to these rural consumers. Now, these G&Ts are organized like cooperatives of cooperatives, and that's going to become important as I talk later about some of the challenges. So each member distribution cooperative has a seat on the board on this generation and transmission cooperative. The G&Ts are also organized as nonprofits, so they don't have a profit motive. And the G&Ts received federal financing, often at subsidized rates, to build out many of their power plants and transmission infrastructure. But in security for these loans, the REA required that these generation and transmission co-ops enter into long-term requirements contracts with their member distribution cooperatives, meaning that the distribution cooperatives would agree to purchase all or nearly all of their wholesale electricity from the G&T. And again, this will become important later on. And this type of contract would guarantee revenue to pay back the federal loans. So to conclude this little introduction, today, according to National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, there are over 800 rural distribution cooperatives operating in the United States. And they provide electricity to 42 million people in 47 states, as you can see on this map, approximately 13% of the US population. And they sell about 13% of all electricity in the US. Many of these distribution co-ops procure their electricity from over 60 generation and transmission cooperatives, and you can see those represented in the bigger colors on this map. So with that, let me pass it back to Melissa.
Okay. Thank you, Gabe. So I'm going to talk about some case studies, and Gabe is as well in this next segment. I was able to conduct research in Spain last year on this topic, and so I'm going to talk to you about several of the cooperatives that I studied there that I think are worth mentioning. The first is called Som Energia, and this was founded in 2010 by a professor and his students. They had 150 members to launch this cooperative. It was Spain's first nationwide modern renewable energy cooperative made up of consumers. The first 150 members were consumer members. And their goal is to provide 100% renewable energy and energy efficiency services across the country. They're involved in, going back to those 4 steps in electricity, they're involved in the production side of creating renewable electricity and in the commercialization side, so the selling renewable electricity to consumers. And by the end of 2019, they had grown to 63,000 members. They're producing 17 gigawatt hours a year of renewable electricity. So they've experienced very rapid growth and a very rapid attraction of new members to this platform that they have created to allow people to take advantage of participating in what I call the renewable energy revolution. In order to join this, you pay 100 euros, and then you opt for renewable electricity on your bill. So you don't necessarily have to be investing in a large solar array on your property. You can. They do also work with their members to self-generate. But the most typical membership is just a basic membership where you're buying into a utility scale renewable electricity production. And they're also really working with their members beyond just receiving a bill, but they focus on educating people about this, changing the model for energy production. They talk about participating in a transformative social movement and breaking the existing energy oligopoly. And they have a really fascinating and remarkable way of organizing amongst their members nationwide that combines a use of technology to link people across the country with in-person meetings, because they have broken their membership up into local groups that can meet in person. So they combine the larger meetings via technology with building personal relationships at the local level that are focused on members educating members about energy conservation and different ways that their members can reduce their energy demands. So that's one example. The next I want to talk about is Cooperativa Eléctrica San Francisco de Asís. And this is more in the vein of the electric cooperatives that Gabe was talking about from the New Deal era. This is still in Spain, so but this is an almost century-old electric cooperative that is a distribution cooperative, so providing power to a municipality, producing the power and distributing it on low voltage wires. They were really integral to launching the growth of a textile industry and being able to provide electricity to this particular town of Crevillente in Spain. So before the cooperative existed, the town did not have electricity. They own and operate the local distribution network. And they were very forward thinking. So starting in the early 1990s, they started transitioning away from fossil fuels because their membership and leadership of the cooperative was concerned about combating climate change. And now they power this community of 28,000 people entirely on renewable energy. They also think about commitments to the community beyond their environmental commitments. And so they have a social fund where they're annually putting investments into the community in places like building free housing for the elderly. They run a funeral home. They're paying for various sports and arts and educational events in the community as well. So they're really quite integral to the community and have been there for almost 100 years. They're also going into the schools to work with students to change consumer behavior and teach students how to conserve energy. And in 2010, they wanted to have a bigger impact on on climate change, and so this historic cooperative became the parent company of Nzaou-Kongo Group, which is another cooperative I'm going to talk about in the case studies here. So Nzaou-Kongo Group is a power supply cooperative, and it is supplying 100% renewable power. So launched in 2010 by this historic cooperative. And Nzaou-Kongo's focus is on supplying power nationwide in Spain. So it's not just to this individual town that I was talking about. They say their purpose is not strictly economic, although they are focused on the most affordable price. They are going to only provide 100% clean energy at the most affordable price. They've created an app for consumers to educate people about how to lower and optimize their electricity usage, and they're studying how to promote distributed generation in a way that's affordable to their customers. By 2019, they had also grown tremendously, and they're now the largest electricity cooperative purchasing group in Spain, supplying 50 gigawatt hours a year of renewable electricity to their members. They have 21 participating cooperatives at this point, and also social economy businesses such as nonprofits. And so they're able to provide electricity at this point to power over 100,000 people. Now I'm going to switch to one example from the US, and then I'll turn it back to Gabe so you can hear about another US example. Cobb EMC and Green Energy EMC. These are cooperatives that are operating in Georgia. Cobb EMC is a traditional electricity distribution cooperative founded during the New Deal era. They brought electricity to their service area in Georgia. They put in the original wires, and now they're serving 200,000 members in Georgia. So they're one of the top 10 largest electric co-ops in the US. They're highly reliable, top 3 in the US for power reliability, and they have very low rates within the state of Georgia. They are participating in another cooperative, Green Energy EMC, and that is an entity that was formed to broker contracts for renewables. So in 2012, this Cobb EMC got out in front on solar, utility scale solar, and worked with their state PSC to get one of the first utility scale solar installations east of the Mississippi River. It was the largest installation when it went in. By 2019, Cobb EMC had the most megawatts in solar of any US cooperative. They have the largest percentage of solar of any Eastern cooperative on their most optimal days, 40%. Those would be days where the sun is shining and electricity demands are low. And they're also working with customers to promote reductions in demand. They're offering different billing and technology to promote demand management and the incentives for electric vehicles so that they can move transportation off of fossil fuels. And this is all happening within the state of Georgia, which has 0 public laws that promote renewable electricity or set climate change goals. So the reason I have highlighted the COB EMC and Green Energy EMC story in the US is to underscore the fact that the economics for switching to solar are really quite strong, even in a place where the laws don't provide incentives. We're seeing this historic cooperative making pretty big efforts to switch its supply to renewables. Now, it's not nearly what I've seen in the case studies in Spain. And so I want to end this part by talking about why renewable electricity cooperatives have grown so rapidly in Spain so that we can think about the lessons to be learned for other countries. Spain, following EU legislation, set a national renewables goal in law. And the goal was that by 2010, they would have at least 29% of their electric generation from renewables. And they coupled that with very generous government subsidies. They also passed comprehensive reforms of their electricity sector in 1997 and then amended it in 2007. They essentially opened electricity generation, transmission, distribution, and marketing to any entity and guaranteed access to the grid. They facilitated a wholesale market pool to fix the price of electricity, and they established a national system of certifying what they're calling guarantees of origin of renewable electricity that prohibits the double use and fraud of those guarantees. So it opened up the ability of a whole sector of cooperatives and other companies that were organized to commercialize renewable energy, purchase it on the wholesale market, and sell it to consumers using these guarantees of origin. The entire regulatory body is national, and it supervises this whole system. So these are some of the public law features that have gone into being able to provide a system that facilitated the emergence in 2010 of Som Energia and the formation of Enercoop Group to rapidly increase membership in their cooperatives and increase the production and commercialization of renewable electricity. So this is my research blog if you want to learn more about the co-op stories, and I'm going to turn it now back over to Gabe.
Thank you. And I'll note that we're pretty close to 10 o'clock. Aubin, I'm going to assume that we'll just keep going, but let me know if you need me to wrap it up. So I'd like to, I'm really grateful to Melissa for sharing some of her research with me and highlighting some of these really exciting developments that are taking place both in the United States and especially in other countries. And I'm really excited about the prospect of using the cooperative form to shift to a lower carbon electricity system. Let me just check to make sure. Okay, I just got the go ahead to keep going. I'm really excited about using the prospects of using the electricity system, the cooperative form, to shift to a lower carbon electricity system. But I also want to highlight some of the challenges that I think we are seeing in at least some places in the United States when it comes to cooperatives. And there's some evidence that cooperatives as a whole have been slower, have lagged behind in the shift to a lower carbon electricity system than other utilities in the United States. So I'd like to talk a little bit about why and what we can learn from that. So first, I'm going to start with a few data snapshots, although I need to provide a few caveats here. And the first is that there's just really severe limitations on our ability to understand, or at least my ability to understand what's going on with co-ops, and that's because there isn't a great publicly available data set that I'm aware of that codes power plants, all power plants in the United States based on ownership entity type. And so that makes it challenging to understand how co-op power plant owners are doing in the shift to lower carbon resources compared to other entities. And second, as I'll explain further, co-ops have a unique historical situation where they procure a lot of their electricity from federal hydro, and also they have an incentive to procure as opposed to self-own renewable generation. So that all skews the information that we have about how co-ops compare, power supply co-ops compare in the resources they own compared to other utilities. So our data is definitely imperfect, but nevertheless, I think I can illustrate a little bit about what we know about why co-ops are in some cases struggling to shift to a lower carbon electricity system. So this, and I'm going to be talking about some data from MJ Bradley and Associates. This chart that you're looking at right here is based on a data set of 100 generators, the 100 largest utilities in the United States when you look at power generation. And based on this data set, which goes back to 2008, there are 10 co-ops in the top 100. Co-ops are represented down at the bottom of this chart in orange. For-profit utilities are represented in blue, and municipal utilities are represented in red. And although co-ops are a small part of the overall generation picture in terms of the megawatt hours that they generate, when it comes to carbon intensity, they are among the most carbon intensive generators. And you can see they're stacked to the left of this chart. And I'll explain what we can know about that in a second. Let me just check to see if there were, I'm sorry. So the second chart here, also based on the MJ Bradley data, shows that the reason for that is because in terms of self-owned generators, self-owned generation, the co-ops in the United States started with a much higher total percentage of coal in their self-owned fleet of power plants, up to 90% in 2008. And again, that excludes the federal hydro that made up a substantial portion of the power that they were relying on for their distribution co-ops. So you can see that even though they have reduced their reliance on coal at more or less the same rate as other utilities, they were starting from a much higher level of coal reliance. I'll also note that there are other indicators that I won't get into here that co-ops as a whole have been slower to shift to lower carbon electricity sources. Just as this isn't quite an apples to apples comparison, but overall the electric power sector in the US has reduced its carbon dioxide emissions 28% since 2005. In a slightly different time frame, starting from 2009 to 2017, according to the NRECA data, co-ops have reduced their CO2 emissions only about 9%. So again, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but that is consistent with co-ops reducing emissions at a slower time frame. I'm going to just check the chat box to make sure that, okay, that we're still good to keep going. So why is that? Let me talk about a couple of structural factors that contribute to that. So first, during the period of 1979 to 1987, there was a particular law in the United States in response to the energy crisis that meant that co-ops were effectively prohibited from using natural gas. That's the Fuel Use Act. It basically sought to reduce reliance on imported oil and to promote domestically sourced coal. And NRECA reports that about 2/3 of power plants that were developed by co-ops at that time that are currently in existence were developed at that time and were therefore coal-fired power plants. And the second factor that might contribute to why co-ops have likely been slower to shift to renewable energy is because they are largely exempt from federal income tax, and therefore they don't get the direct benefits of federal renewable energy tax credits. And these tax credits have been the primary driver, according to multiple studies, for the economic shift to renewable energy among all utilities. So I want to give another example of a kind of challenge that to shifting to a lower carbon electricity system. And here I want to talk about the relationship between these generation and transmission cooperatives and the distribution cooperatives in the United States. And so this is going to use a case study from the Tri-State Generation and Transmission Association service territory. This is the power supply cooperative that serves the states of Wyoming, Nebraska, Colorado, and New Mexico. It has about 43 member cooperatives, and it's one of the largest power supply cooperatives in the United States. So a couple of things that have happened here. So first, there are a number of co-ops in this, member distribution co-ops of Tri-State that have become disgruntled with the wholesale rates that Tri-State was charging, and also with the lack of progress on renewable energy, and particularly the lack of the ability of the power supply co-ops to put locally sited renewable energy on their distribution grids, or to support customer solar. And so because of that, one of the first things that happened was in 2016, the Kit Carson Distribution Co-op, which serves the Taos area in New Mexico, bought out its contract with Tri-State for $37 million. And it subsequently entered into a long-term 10-year contract with an energy brokerage firm, Guzman Energy. And under that contract, it was able to project that it would reduce rates to customers over time and substantially increase renewable energy, and it's made progress on both of those fronts. Later, a second distribution co-op member of Tri-State, Delta Montrose, after several years of legal battles, also reached an agreement to exit Tri-State. We don't know the cost of the buyout, but one of the interesting things was that it went to the Colorado Public Utility Commission and sought the commission's oversight over the buyout fee, and they reached a settlement last year. Now there are at least 2 more electric co-ops that are seeking to leave Tri-State and have asked the Colorado PUC for the same type of oversight, and these co-ops are 2 of the largest distribution co-ops within Tri-State's, among Tri-State's members. Now these conflicts have had a significant impact on Tri-State. And one of the reasons is because when Tri-State's distribution members exit the power supply cooperative, that means that the fixed costs of Tri-State, the debt service on its existing debt, are spread among the remaining members. So it raises the potential that already high wholesale rates could go up even higher. This is kind of similar to the utility debt spiral that we hear about with for-profit utilities. And so as a result of both these factors and also climate and clean energy laws, very ambitious climate and clean energy laws passed in Colorado and in New Mexico, Tri-State in January of this year, announced a new responsible energy plan where it committed to retire its 2 remaining coal-fired power plants in Colorado and New Mexico, and also committed to add 1 gigawatt of additional renewable energy capacity to its portfolio by 2024. So there's a lot more to the story that I won't get into here, but this is an interesting example that shows some of the challenges of the current power supply distribution co-op relationship, and also shows how the action of individual distribution co-ops has both created new options for some of those co-ops and also pushed the power supply co-op in a cleaner direction. So I'm gonna try to wrap up by talking briefly about some of the reasons that I see that there are challenges in this power supply co-op relationship, and also what we might be able to do to strengthen supports for co-ops and oversight that are seeking to move to a cleaner energy electricity sector. So first, I'm going to highlight two reasons that power supply co-ops have disincentives to shifting to lower carbon electricity. The first is that power supply co-ops likely have incentives to invest in fossil fuel power plants that grow organizational size and revenue. There's some other scholarship out there that shows that in the United States, at least, co-ops in general have management structures that don't provide a whole ton of rigorous oversight for managers. And with power supply cooperatives, or GNTs, they are an arm's length removed from the actual member owners who are seeking to have electricity in their residents and businesses, because their members are cooperatives themselves. So they're like one step removed. And some of the research shows that they don't generally have the same kind of sophisticated boards and oversight models that happen in corporate America. And also the examples that I have seen show that executives are often compensated based on how large the organization is when it comes to power supply cooperatives. So the more people, the more revenue, the more people you employ, the more you might get paid. And so you can imagine how the idea of trying to sell or close down large fossil fuel power plants and coal mines and shift to a model where you're purchasing more renewable energy from other developers might be a disincentive for management. And the second issue is that increasing local low-carbon resources, which is what a lot of distribution co-ops want, can threaten the generation, transmission, distribution co-op business model. And that's because the more local renewable energy you have in distribution co-ops, the less revenue goes to the G&T co-op. And that's the same for energy efficiency, which Melissa talked about. And so under the current business model, there is a disincentive to allow local distribution co-op members to increase renewables on their local grids or energy efficiency on their local grids. And I want to talk about one final factor, which is that cooperatives in the United States have a light level of oversight and regulation. And that goes back to when the Rural Electricity Administration was created in the 1930s. At that time, the only reason for utility regulation was to protect against monopoly pricing and discrimination. And the REA and other co-op proponents looked at co-ops and said, these are member-owned nonprofit entities. They don't have a profit model. There's no real reason to regulate them. And so they advocated for largely self-regulation by states, no regulation by what would become FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the United States. Now, co-ops can be regulated by states, but in practice, rate regulated, like utilities in many states, but states tend to exempt or weakly regulate co-ops. And generation and transmission cooperatives have largely argued that they should not be regulated by either states or the federal government. Importantly, states also don't subject co-ops, or don't usually subject co-ops, to clean energy mandates, at least not at the same level as utilities, as for-profit utilities, or to resource planning requirements. And I'm going to talk just a moment about the importance of resource planning. Going back to the idea of the rationale for regulating utilities, sometime around the 1980s, regulators realized that it was important to provide an additional level of oversight over resource planning. And when it comes to planning for climate change, resource planning, deciding what kinds of clean energy resources or lower carbon resources will be adequate and economic in the future, is the entire name of the game. But co-ops maintained their position that regulation for co-ops wasn't necessary because they were self-regulating. In the 1980s, however, we saw that because of the experience with investments into nuclear power plants, where there were lots of cost overruns and abandonments of nuclear power plants, that a rigorous oversight over resource planning, having experts come in and test assumptions and scenarios from the outside, was valuable even when there was a profit interest in getting the resource planning right. But we don't see that type of rigorous oversight for co-ops in the United States. So let me conclude by talking a little bit about some ways that public policy can strengthen co-ops and supports and oversight when it comes to positioning co-ops for a shift to a low-carbon electricity system. So first, these old coal plants are a real problem, and I recommend that both the Rural Utility Service, which is the successor to the Rural Electrification Administration, and states use policies to support the retirement of old coal-fired power plants. Things like securitization, which is being used here in New Mexico to help support getting rid of stranded assets. The second is to subject power-producing cooperatives to a rigorous resource planning process, and also to exit contract buyout fee oversight, similar to what's happened in Colorado. So using the model that Colorado has developed for providing more oversight of both its power supply cooperative and providing more leverage to distribution cooperatives that want to go further on renewable energy. And finally, I'd recommend that the Rural Utility Service play the same kind of role that the REA played when it came to electrifying rural America in the first place, but in this case, in trying to decarbonize rural America. And one particular thing that it could do would be to help develop new wholesale rate models for the power supply distribution co-op relationship. This could be something analogous to decoupling utility rates in the for-profit utility sector, or developing new utility business models, which several public utility commissions are doing. And with that, I'll conclude, and thank you very much for this opportunity, and happy to take any questions if there's time.